Hey folks, today we're talking about toxic masculinity. I'm going to see if I can paint a picture for you showing us that we've been doing it all wrong. I'm going to propose that our basic understanding of toxic masculinity and why it's bad is pretty much on point, but our understanding of where it comes from or what's causing it is not only somewhat wrong, but that the things that cause toxic masculinity are probably a lot closer to home than most of us imagine. That in itself is super fun and interesting, but of course the real reason I want to run this past you is because if we know more about where toxic masculinity is coming from and what's causing it, then we know what needs to change in order to solve it. And that, my friends, is the gold amongst the radioactive lead that is toxic masculinity. We're all about that. Before we get into it, quick little heads up. We're referencing sexual assault statistics in this episode and a couple of sort of related topics just here and there. Not in a graphic way, but please check in with yourself and just make sure that today is an okay day to think about such things. Alrighty, so we have to start with what is toxic masculinity. And obviously I know many of you know this, but anyway, to quote from Wikipedia, quote, "Toxic masculinity generally refers to the harmful aspects of traditional male gender norms, things like emotional suppression, aggressive dominance, stoic toughness at all costs, and devaluing anything seen as feminine." End quote. There's two stories that we tend to choose from when we think about what toxic masculinity is about. The first story, and by far the most common one, is to imply that masculinity itself is toxic. It's a perspective that often seems to sound like all men are toxic, but some men are able to keep it in check, probably just temporarily. To keep it in check better than others or something like that. The second story is perhaps more likely to pop up either in in-depth academic circles or some therapeutic circles or people who are really deep diving into the topic for whatever reason. And the second story is to say that while everyone has the capacity to be toxic, there's something about what we're doing to men between when they're born and when they become problematic, and that thing is creating a toxic expression of masculinity. Not necessarily masculinity itself. The difference between the two stories comes down to this. If a man does something you don't like, are you more likely to see him as the problem or to see the way he's been brought up and socialized as the problem? I don't think it's going to come as much of a surprise to you that I am in the second camp. I acknowledge that because I present to the world as a male person, I have a pretty decent bias in this conversation. So, of course, the second option is going to be my preference. Just from my own perspective, my own lived experience, the first story, the one that tells us that all men just are toxic and should be regarded as such, that is, if I'm being honest, awful to be around. It's painful. I hate it in terms of what it means for how I personally get treated by the world, regardless of how I'm actually conducting myself. So I admit and I acknowledge that I have a massive bias in this, and in doing so, we're actually having a little bit of a fun moment here, you and me, because as I acknowledge that bias and the pain from being regarded that way, I'm demonstrating a little bit of what positive masculinity might look like. So I notice that something's painful for me, and rather than squash it down or ignore it, I speak up about it. It's very different to pretending that something doesn't hurt, avoiding naming it, and hoping that it goes away. Those behaviours tend to calcify the experience straight into toxic masculinity, and that's why we need to encourage men to speak up when they're in pain. I point this out because in my experience, normally when I say something like what I've just said to you now, i.e. this thing we're doing is painful for me, it's really common for someone to say back to me something along the lines of, "Wow, if you think it's hard being male, you should try being female sometime," This very much has the effect of discouraging healthy expressions of emotions and masculinity, and maybe even makes one start to feel a little bit toxic, and maybe a little bit angry towards women. Do you see the irony? It's like putting a fire out with gasoline and then being surprised it's still burning. Anyway, back to the plot. I have my bias that makes the second story much more attractive to me, but what I want to articulate here is the ability of that second story to take us straight towards the solutions, whereas the first story just kind of leaves us flailing and hoping that something will change. So, since the second story is very much about compassion and understanding, rather than just blaming the individual, you could say that what I'm about to articulate is that if we want to make the world a better place for women, we're going to have to make it a better place for men. Kind of perfect, yes, since here at Pan Political we care about everyone. So we're going to be spending most of this episode exploring the second story because that's where I reckon the juice is. But before we do so, I want to address the first story a little bit. And that's the story that essentially men are just toxic until proven otherwise. And the sad truth is, I don't really have a great way to address this first story. I would if I could, but in some ways, believing in this story comes down to just that. It's a question of belief, and more specifically, who you believe in and who you care about. It's a fascinating question, because what you believe tells you a lot about your inherent biases. And just a quick little bit of info for those of you that have not bumped into that language before. An inherent bias is a deeply built-in prejudice or form of favoritism that we have towards certain groups of people. We all have inherent biases, no matter how well-intentioned and well-informed we are, and we are aware of our built-in prejudices to varying degrees. Regardless, they impact our actions in ways that can be really harmful on other people. The idea that we have inherent biases really attracted a lot of attention for the ways that tests could show that well-intentioned, non-racist white people still had a lot of negative bias against people of colour. Some great work has been done around themes like the degree to which people are more likely to think they saw a person of colour doing something bad, or the degree to which they'll see a person of colour as being some kind of danger to them. The opposite is also just as true. We're much more likely to not believe a criticism about someone that we have a positive bias towards. We are less likely to want to convict them, more likely to want to promote them, etc., etc., etc. To the topic at hand, the way that inherent bias applies to gender is really simple, albeit a little disturbing. With people with whom we have a positive inherent bias, we're more likely to view their bad behaviour as society's fault. We're likely to think that they're just responding to the circumstances around them and are less to blame for their actions. On the one hand, obviously, when someone that we have a negative inherent bias for does something unfavourable, we will lock onto the idea that they, and probably they alone, are the problem. If you're a research geek like me, now's a great time to pause the podcast and do some research on inherent bias as it relates to gender. If your research or the search engines you're using don't lead you to the effect called women are wonderful, then you haven't done enough research yet, or there's other biases in play influencing your research. So keep going. What you'll eventually find is that you can measure inherent bias quite accurately, and you'll also find that both women and men have an inherent bias in favour of women. This number can be expressed in a percentage form. Different studies measure different things and so come up with marginally different figures. But as an approximation, about 70% of people have a positive bias towards women and about 30% have a positive bias towards men. And just as a curious side note, that's about the same degree of difference that we happen to see in how white people are viewed versus people of colour. But circling back around to the subject of toxic masculinity, I asked my AI colleagues what percentage of the population are inclined to see bad male behaviour as the fault of individual men versus whether we're inclined to see bad female behaviour as the result of individual women. And what do you know? The numbers are pretty much exactly the same as they are for those inherent bias tests. About 70% of people think that individual men are to blame for their behaviour, rather than seeing that social issues and influences play into the mix. For me, what this means is that when people subscribe to the first story and are more inclined to exclusively blame individual men for the situation that they're in, particularly if it's coupled with a more compassionate and understanding approach towards women, well, this just tells me they've got a pretty strong inherent bias that they're probably not aware of. So that's my take on the first story. Let's get on to the second story. What I want to do here is bolster my claim that there's a very strong case to be made that cultural and societal conditions play a large role in creating toxic expressions of masculinity. For those of you with a mathematical mind, I'm going to frame this as a formula, and that's this. Your experiences in life, multiplied by the support you receive, approximately equals your potential risk of expressing yourself in toxic ways. So again, your experiences in life, multiplied by the supports you receive, equals your potential for toxic behaviour. Life is more complicated than that, of course, just because everything to do with humans always is. You can't reduce the human condition down to a simple formula, no matter how great that would be. Nevertheless, there's a fair bit of support for the understanding this gives us, so I'm going to walk you through it. Firstly, let's talk about your experiences in life. One of the clearest and most scientifically and academically backed up ways of assessing what happens in your younger years is via what's called your ACE score, which is short for Adverse Childhood Experiences. We won't go into all of the details, but essentially this methodology focuses on 10 categories of experiences that have the potential to have an adverse effect on your life and can actually give you a straight-up number for how you rank against others. It's a useful and slightly freaky little tool. The psychological underpinnings of this are that if you have a high ACE score and don't receive supports for that, your outcomes in life can be predicted with, frankly, a bit of a disturbing degree of accuracy. And you might notice that the psychological underpinnings of this body of work around ACE scores is extremely close to the formula we're using today of your experience multiplied by your supports equals your risk of toxic expression. Before we get into the research on gender differences in these 10 categories, I acknowledge that this is really sensitive stuff, and it often deteriorates into what you might call a statistics fight, by which I mean a fight where statistics are thrown back and forth sort of as weapons. Because, as we all know, you can sort of use statistics to put any angle you want on a story. So there's two things I'll say about that before we get into the details themselves. Firstly, I'll be as transparent as I can in presenting this information, which follows on from me being about as transparent and honest as I could with myself while I was in the research stages. I will also be weaving in some data about things that happen to adults, not just the things that happens to kids, but again, I'll try and be clear and transparent while I'm doing that. The second thing I want to say before we begin is that fortunately, we don't need to get too caught up in the details of this. I'll just give you the ending before we begin. What we're going to find is that out of the 10 ACE categories, we're going to simply name the last 5 without going into any detail because they're all about the same for boys and girls. With the other 5, I'm going to show that more of them seem to negatively impact boys and men. But if you are sceptical about my conclusions or your research shows different results, this is still a useful exercise we're going through and it doesn't affect the next stage. So my suggestion is, if you can, don't worry too much about the details. And I do really encourage you to do your own research in all of this. There's just one research bias you're going to want to be aware of, particularly if this is the first time doing your own detailed research on gender issues. And the thing I want you to be aware of is this. There's a profound bias in the collective body of research on gender issues, which is that almost all research has an interest in the effect of a given situation on girls and women, but is generally not interested in the effect of a given situation on boys and men. You can see this really clearly if you go into Google Scholar and search for a phrase like, quote, impact on women, unquote, compared to a phrase like, quote, impact on men, unquote. That's a very crude, but surprisingly effective measure, and it'll show you a pretty extreme skew in where the focus of research is. Last time I checked out this crude little effective method, there were about 20 papers interested in women for every one paper that was interested in men. This bias in the research is further amplified by the publishing process, which will often flat out not want to publish stories showing that men are suffering, or if they do publish those stories, they won't frame it as a men's issue. So if you just do a cursory analysis of the research, just be aware that the bulk of the research that's out there will be about the effects of a given situation on women, even if the situation is actually worse for men. If this all sounds a little bit academic, let me give you a quick and tangible example. If you imagine a bomb goes off in a civilian area of a war zone or something like that, and if you imagine that 50 people are killed, including an equal number of women and men, it will still likely be reported as something like, quote, bomb blast kills 50, including women and children, end quote. This bias I'm talking about, where the research and the reporting is more interested in the impacts on women, means we're generally looking at research and reporting that's coming off a very uneven playing field. So get in there and do your own research, but just, bear that bias in mind. Okay, so let's get into it. Out of those 10 ACE categories, the first 3 are all subcategories of abuse. Category 1 is emotional abuse. So that means being put down, being insulted, being made to feel afraid. Surveys seem to show relatively even scores here between female folks and male folks, by which I mean there are differences, but there's only a couple of percentage points in it. So let's just call that category about even. The second category is about physical abuse, which is generally defined as physical violence that leaves marks. When you just look at violence within the home, girls and boys are not that far apart from each other. Boys receive a little more, and boys definitely receive more spankings, but we're still only talking about a sort of a 20%-ish sort of a difference. So look, that's not nothing. That's not nothing. That's statistically significant, but it's also not huge. What is more substantial is violence that happens outside the home. So boys, and then definitely men, receive a lot more physical violence outside the home from a whole variety of sources. By the time a boy has become a man, almost all research shows that he's receiving twice the amount of physical violence as the women around him, and that's even with intimate partner violence factored into the numbers, which is much more likely to flow from men towards women. So for this category of physical violence, it looks like men receive around twice as much, with differences between different age groups and different cultures. So men lose out on that category. The third category is on sexual abuse. Straight up, I'm just going to count this as being worse on women than it is on men, but I think the statistics are not as extreme as most people think they are. If you sum up the research, you generally get a figure that suggests that women are something like 1.5 times more likely to experience sexual assault than men. So already, that figure's probably nowhere near as much of a difference as most people think. But you also want to bear in mind that a lot of this data comes from self-reporting, And because men are not used to seeing themselves as victims and not speaking up for that, they're also unlikely to recognise sexual misconduct against them as a form of assault. As a consequence, there's a big underreporting element at play here. But either way, I'm counting this category as being that girls and women experience more sexual abuse. And I'm just so sorry to everyone that's ever experienced sexual assault, which I think is probably most of us, myself included. Please reach out to your friends or support services if this conversation has stirred things up for you. So now we move on to the next two ACE categories that are both related to forms of neglect. The fourth category is on emotional neglect, meaning feeling unloved or unprotected. To explore this, I want to draw your attention to what's often referred to as the Baby X experiments. A simple version of this is that when you wrap a plastic doll in clothing that suggests it's a girl and watch how people interact with it, and then you get the same plastic doll and wrap it in a way that suggests it's a boy, what you find is that the girls get more gentle handling, more smiling, more soothing talk, and more in the way of offering other dolls or nurturing toys. With the boys, you get more physical play, more bouncing, more encouragement of active movement, and more offering of things like trains and other masculine toys. So neither of these is necessarily better or worse, or rather they both have benefits and drawbacks. But they certainly affirm the fact that gender-based socialisation kicks in really early and really strong. For our purposes, this stuff gets really interesting when you add in some other research that shows that more contact between, say, parents and babies or between parents and children, more contact is correlated with less violence later in life. And there's even research done with rats that shows that rats that receive less grooming and physical attention wind up with more illnesses, and particularly relevant to what we're talking about today, they wind up with more angry behaviour. So yeah, in terms of this category of emotional neglect, there's an evidence base to suggest that boys and men receive less emotional care and that this translates to challenging behaviours later in life. So I'm counting this category against men. And the fifth category is physical neglect, which is about having basic needs like food, clothing, or medical care being met. In the Australian context and the context of other developed economies, this one seems to be about even between boys and girls and women and men. And actually, the next five categories within the ACE scores system all seem to me to be approximately the same, both in terms of my understanding as I've been observing the world as I go through life over the decades, and also from the research I've done just to make sure that I'm not miles off track with this one. So I'll name the categories, and we're counting them all as being basically more or less the same between boys and girls. So those next five ACE categories, they all relate to what's called household-related challenges, and they include the witnessing of domestic violence, being around substance abuse in the home, having mental illness or suicide attempts in the family, experiencing parental separation or divorce, and finally, having an incarcerated household member. So the research suggests that whether you're male or female, you're likely to be around these things to about the same level. So we're counting all of those as about the same for our purposes today. So where does that leave us? As I said, you might or might not agree with me on all the details that I've gone into here, and that's okay. But my read on things is that things are about even between the genders on about half of those measures, but girls and women probably experience more sexual harm, while boys and men probably receive more physical abuse and more emotional neglect. I think the point I'm wanting to make is that even if we disagree over some of the details, and please have a look at my research links over on X if you want to follow up on the sources I've been using. And do your own research if something here feels like it couldn't possibly be right. But even if we disagree on some of the details, it's fair to say that none of the genders get an absolutely free ride on what is now some very tried and tested ways of measuring the challenges we face. Now it's time to look at all of the supports you have around you to help you with whatever life experiences you've had, whether they be in childhood or adulthood. It's been said that it's one thing to have something bad happen to you, but it's how the world responds that decides what the lasting impact on you is going to be. So the question is, given that we all carry some load of tough experiences in childhood or later in life, what kinds of support actually help us heal instead of harden? And do men and women get equal access to those supports? I'm going to read out a list of the 10 most commonly called upon supports, and we'll compare them as we go to how much access women and men have to these supports. Support number 1 is close friends that you can actually call on. And here we find women, on average, have more friends and deeper emotional conversations with them. Many men have fewer friends overall, and those friendships are often activity-based rather than what you might call heart-to-heart. That leaves a lot of guys carrying heavy stuff by themselves. Support number 2 is emotional literacy, so the ability to name what you're feeling and share it clearly. Me and frustrated female partners can't all be wrong when they say that many men struggle here, and the science backs that. Women tend to grow up practicing this skill more. Men often get the opposite message. Support number 3 is the permission to ask for help without shame. So simply admitting, I'm not okay, and reaching out for help. Women generally find this far easier to do. For many men, admitting they're not okay still feels like failure. That old script about manning up is pretty stubborn and pretty persistent. Support number 4 is whether the world that you're in treats violence against you as a serious problem. So when a disaster or a war hits, like we mentioned before, do the headlines around you still say something like, X number of women and children were killed, while the men who died barely rate a mention? Boys and men will also get the shake it off message after physical fights or assaults. Society cares deeply about violence against women, as we should, but violence against men is still often invisible or just shrugged off or ignored. Support number 5, not being gaslit or dismissed when you speak up. So if a man talks about his struggles, the common reply he'll get is often something along the lines of, well, yeah, women have it way worse though, or you've got all the privilege, what are you complaining about? Or even, yeah, we'll get to your quote-unquote problems once we've dealt with the real ones. So that's the emotional equivalent of being told that your pain doesn't count. Everyone gets dismissed when they speak up sometimes, but this particular flavour hits men especially hard. Support number 6 is not being victim-blamed. So women still face horrible victim blaming, especially around sexual assault, and that's inexcusable. At the same time, many people assume that men just can't be assaulted. Like some version of a story that he must have wanted it, or that if he had an erection, that means that was consent, which to my eyes is about as stupid as saying, well, if she was enjoying it at the beginning of the assault, or if she had an orgasm, then obviously she was enjoying it. Both versions of this are absolutely awful. Pain is pain, assault is assault. But I think in general, if our responses to women are sometimes not good, then their responses to when men speak up about sexual assault are worse. Support number 7 is having support services that exist for you. So here in Australia, over the 10 years leading up to 2024, roughly 98% of gender-specific government funding for support services went to women's programs. So that includes violence response, health, counselling and everything else. Men's services and supports do exist, but they're dramatically underfunded, even while male suicide and workplace deaths and shorter lifespans are sort of starting occasionally to get headlines. It's also got to be said, well, let's put it this way. I have it on good authority that the reproductive system is a fairly expensive set of organs to maintain. So you'd expect that if everything else was equal, there would be something of an increase in funding towards female-specific services, just on that physiological level. But that doesn't explain the 98% funding number. There's a lot more going on there. Support number 8 is counselling services that actually reach you. So men make up 20% or less of counselling clients. Whether that's because men don't go or services don't feel welcoming to them, it doesn't really matter. Either way, the gap is very real and very costly. Related to support number 8, support number 9 is having counselling services that understand and are compassionate towards your gender's experiences. So many therapists are brilliant, but some spaces still treat male pain as suspicious or secondary to something else, or as perhaps the man's fault. Workshops, men's sheds, or male-friendly practitioners who get the unique pressures of being male do exist, and they make a massive difference, but there's certainly not necessarily that many of them. And before we get on to the last point I want to make around support services, I just want to inject a little personal story here that relates to what we've just been talking about with counselling services. Because I know it can be kind of hard to wrap your head around what I'm talking about there. I'd say I've been in self-development circles for about 30 years, and more specifically studying or practicing psychology for 20 years. And it's been my experience that once I realised that negative and sexist attitudes and comments about men were bad for me, I started sort of noticing them everywhere around me. And whereas most of the psychology community is very well informed about sexism against women, they're mostly unaware of what it looks like when it's against men. In fact, I've been told on more than one occasion that there is no sexism against men, that it's just simply not possible, which in itself is a sexism. I even had a therapist of mine once tell me that I shouldn't use the word sexism to describe what happens to men. Pretty amazing. The sorts of things I'm talking about when I say sexism's against men are anything from really simple ones, such as the habit of calling bad jokes dad jokes, whereas to gender flip that would be unlikely to let someone describe something as a old wives' tale these days, through to much more substantial ways of looking at the world through very different lenses, such as a near obsession with talking about male privileges, coupled with an almost blank refusal to acknowledge that there could be any female privileges. So when I'm sitting in what are supposed to be learning spaces, as any woman who's been in a male-dominated and sexist environment will tell you, it's an incredible additional load to be carrying around with you, to have to constantly keep your composure in the face of negativity and sometimes outright hostility. Sometimes I've resorted to keeping lists each time something sexist is said in a learning space, and it's not uncommon to get over 20 hits in a 2-day workshop. Sometimes it's gotten so bad that I've had to leave workshops halfway through, and sometimes I've wound up connecting with other male-presenting people at the same workshop and effectively forming a little support group just to debrief our experiences and the ways we were being treated. To bring this story around to the point at hand, it's one thing for me to go through this, and I know a lot of men just put up with it because that's how they've been socialised to not show that something's hurting, and they think it's their duty to suffer the wrath of angry women, given what's historically happened to women by men. But it's another thing when you realise that these attitudes actually transfer to the therapeutic environment. Male clients are going to turn up for counselling and either pick up some of the microaggressions that I've been talking about, or have to put up with jokes about men, or have their own issues and concerns gaslit because their therapist can't see them as anything but a predator, or as the powerful role in any situation, or as the privileged ones. That's not therapy. That's re-traumatisation in a lot of cases. And here we are, wondering why less than 20% of counselling clients are male. I humbly suggest there may be a connection. I know that one of the first things I do when I'm trying out a new counsellor is to drop some kind of gender issue into the mix of the conversation, just to see if they're able to look at things from all perspectives. It's stunning how few counsellors pass that test, and I've got to tell you, it's just awful when I've stayed with counsellors who on some level have blamed me for a given situation, not because of me or anything I've done, but because of how they see my gender. That's just got to change, and the psychology community needs a wake-up call, given how crucially important they are as emotional supports. Okay, that's my personal share taken care of. Let's get back to the last point on our list of supports. Finally, support number 10 is family and community networks that hold you. Women often have richer day-to-day emotional connections in family and community settings. Men are more likely to be immersed in work cultures that reward stoicism over vulnerability. Both can be supportive, but they're not interchangeable. So let's face it, I'm sure we disagree on some of the details. And maybe you've thought of some other support services that should be on this list and ones that actually work in men's favour. But returning to the formula, your risk of being in a place that might be regarded as toxic, either by you or those around you, is a factor of the experiences you have in life multiplied by your access to supports. So I don't know how this is tracking for you, but my summary of the data we've been discussing today is that there's a bit of a skew against men in terms of the adverse experiences in childhood and perhaps more later in life. But once we get to support services, there is an incredibly strong skew against men. It is a really, really strong skew. And that, my friends, is why toxic masculinity is a thing. Based on what we've just looked at, it couldn't possibly not be a thing. When life throws you a high ACE score, or just generally gives you a bunch of challenges to deal with, the supports you get next are what will determine whether you grow around those problems or whether they grow around you. And as things stand at the moment, boys and men are getting way too little in the way of the supports that they need. When things are the other way around, when women find themselves struggling under a hard load of challenges without the supports that they need, we see all of those same behaviours. What we call toxic masculinity when it shows up in men is going to look a little different on a woman because it's hard for most of us to pattern match masculine on women and feminine on men. But if you take a moment, you can see all the same patterns of explosions inwardly or explosions outwardly when healthy processing and support isn't available to people who have had challenging experiences. We are, after all human, we're all the same, and this is all just about being human. Before I conclude, I want to touch on two closing thoughts. The first thought is that this all got kind of bleak. There's something creeping in over the last 15 minutes or so, and it's this. When I speak about the ACE scores and the very strong parallels between what happens to you in life and where that's going to leave you, it can sort of start to sound like there's nothing you can do about it. And I just want to say, I personally don't believe that's the case for a second. So sure, we don't have a lot of control over what happens to us in life, but we do have a lot of control over our supports. If there's one thing you might have gotten from this episode, it's that we don't all start from the same spot. However, we've still got agency and options. And out of all of your options for support, you are by far the most important element. So in listening to this, if you're realizing that there's an area of your life that you could use some more support in, I encourage you to lean into that. This is advice that's worked for me and I hope works for you. And that is trust yourself in terms of what you can imagine would be a useful support for you. If this stuff is on your mind, even as we've been talking, you would have already had little fantasies or tiny little visions jumping in and out of your mind about things that you might want to do or things that you can imagine doing to look after yourself. I recommend trusting those little visions and trusting that on some level you've got this and following through with those ideas, no matter how unusual they might be. They're probably going to be perfect for you. And hey, at the end of the day, if you've got no visions and if you need support and nothing else is coming to mind, try out 3 counsellors and have a few sessions with the one that you feel most drawn to. And that might not be the friendliest one, by the way, since what we need from counsellors is some loving challenge as well as a sense that they're on our side. If you have to save money for it, then do so. It's one of the best investments in yourself you could ever make. So yeah, I just wanted to say again, you have a very high level of agency in where you go from here, regardless of what's come before. The second closing thought is that, frankly, I feel like this episode in particular had me sort of banging on about men's issues and poor men for what felt like a fairly long period of time. I don't know whether you heard it that way, but it sort of felt that way a little bit to me as I was talking through it. A reason for that is that it's my experience that you, dear listener, already have a pretty good grounding in basic feminist ideas. You're already on board with a decent understanding of the issues women face. So in this podcast, I'm speaking to an audience that doesn't have a huge gap in that particular knowledge area. But it's an audience that's keen to understand more about what's going on for men. So I'm sort of speaking to that. And it would sound really different if I was speaking to an audience that didn't already have that grounding and that respect for women's issues. Also, in response to that feeling like I've been banging on a bit about men's issues, it's worth stating on the record that I don't care about men any more than I care about women, which is to say a lot. It's just that the vast majority of the thinking out there isn't interested in what's going on for men, and as a consequence, in my opinion, is really missing the point in terms of what needs to happen next. I think if your only interest is in stopping the bad behaviour from men towards women, then we have to get into the weeds of what's actually causing that behaviour if we want to change it. So, ironically, if you only care about women, just ignoring the concerns of men is not working. And obviously, if you care about both women and men and the other genders, as I think you should, then this episode is probably all pretty self-evident in terms of why I've been talking about what I've been talking about. If at times I've been critical, for instance, of there being more support services for women, just be clear, I'm not proposing that we take away or close any of those services. Rather, I'm proposing perhaps, if it's appropriate, that we find ways to make them more available to all, or alternatively, we duplicate those services for men. Doing so will be like a force multiplier for the benefits that are already being done by services that are currently only available for women. Okay, let's finish up with action outcomes and then fact-checking. So here we go, with a list of 12 action outcomes flowing out of this episode. Number 1, one of the most important things is just making a little bit of space for men's issues. And congratulations, friend, even if you were uncomfortable while I was meandering through those ACE scores or the supports that men do or don't receive, you did it. You did it. You yourself here today did something to unwind toxic masculinity just by making space for a conversation about it. And if you managed to get this far without becoming a misogynist, then double points for you. Great having you on board. Action outcome number 2, care about all genders, not just men, not just women, not just minorities, but everyone. Action outcome number 3, if you happen to find yourself running a conference on gender issues and you don't have approximately 50% male presenting speakers and listeners, then what's going on? Get a quota. Action outcome number 4, stop talking about sexual assault as if it only happens to women. Action outcome number 5, please don't ever say that, and I quote, "What women fear from men is death, and what men fear from women is occasional humiliation," unquote. And sorry if I got a couple of those words wrong. Phrases like that deny the lack of supports that are out there for men, and they deny what happens to men when those supports are not there. Men are dying from it. So unfortunately, men do have death to fear in the gender war, as do women and minority genders. Action outcome number 6, recognise the incredible importance of the emotional skills that women are more likely to have and beg them for help. Okay, so I don't literally mean get down on our knees in the street, but let's help women to recognise how crucial those human skills are and how crucial it is that they're shared, and the incredible importance that women bring in being more fluent with those skills. One way this can be done is by bringing boys and men up in exactly the same ways we bring up girls and women. And another way is by extending the loving care and compassionate positive regard that is often reserved only for the sisterhood to everyone. Let men have access to the spaces where they can experience what an emotionally intelligent and caring conversation and culture is like, because that's the only way to learn. Action outcome number 7. Personally, I reckon all of this is another reason to take the focus off the separation and differences between genders that we tend to obsess over and just treat people like they're all the same. The less we seek out gender differences in the world, the less we'll wind up with problems of socialisation and sexism like we've been talking about today. Feel free to join me in seeing yourself as having no gender and in seeing others that way too. I honestly think it's the only sustainable solution. And sort of repeating myself, but yeah, if you're a parent or a teacher or a carer of some description, please treat boys and men with the same care and compassion you treat girls and women. It'll make them much better men. Action outcome number 8. Stop talking about toxic masculinity as if it comes from patriarchy. I mean, it does. It absolutely does. But at the same time, if it's true to say that patriarchy started the process of creating toxic masculinity, it's us, now, that are doing patriarchy's work for them. To blame the problem on patriarchy alone is to avoid and not take responsibility for our role in creating an environment where toxic masculinity is a thing. Action outcome number 9. When men speak about their suffering, don't shut them down. Action outcome number 10. Start including men's issues in gender studies classes. At the moment, you can basically substitute the words gender studies for women's studies. It's an astounding battle to get even a day's content about men in a year-long gender studies course. And while it's like that, it's going to look like there are no male issues, and there's absolutely no chance we're going to solve the things that are creating toxic masculinity. Action outcome number 11. If you're currently running gender-separate groups of any description, please pause and ask yourself if they really have to be that way, and ask if you're in a position to lovingly and gently challenge the assumption that you can't have the other gender around. And action outcome number 12. Listen to this podcast as you've already done and share it with someone else that might benefit from it. As you've been listening to this episode, has anyone jumped to mind where you're like, oh yeah, that person, that's probably pretty relevant to them, they might enjoy having a listen? Go right ahead, hit the share button and share it. Thanks for listening, folks. We'll finish up with fact-checking and we're done. See you in the next one.
Hi, I'm an AI tasked with fact-checking this episode. In general, claims made in this episode stack up. Specific claims that are easily verified include: Baby X experiments show the claimed differences. Men make up 20% or less of counseling clients. Women have stronger friend networks. Male support services receive about 1/50th of funding compared to female services. Some claims that need qualification. That women enjoy a 70% inherent bias benefit, number is approximate. That men receive twice the violence, number is approximate. That women receive around 1.5 times the sexual assault of men, number is approximate. And also noting that ACE scores vary widely, but claims are approximately accurate. There are no claims made that can't be easily and approximately supported by research.
Hey friends, how about this strange old thing we call capitalism, huh? I have some thoughts. First off, I want to say this clearly. If you're just listening, that's genuinely enough. I see the download numbers, I know you're there, and it means something very real to me. You're turning these ideas over in your head, maybe chatting about them with others, maybe looking at the world a little differently. That's the whole point of this for me. No pressure, no guilt. I'm grateful you're on the ride. At the same time, I know some of you want to support this more actively, and you're in a position to do so. That's where Patreon comes in. It's a simple, direct way for you to throw a bit of fuel on the fire if the episodes have been useful or meaningful to you. I used to feel weird about asking for such things, but then I realised it's not that different from buying a book that changed your perspective, or paying for a workshop, or even just grabbing a coffee for a friend who's been good to talk to. This show is my version of that, something I'm putting real time and care into, and that you can support if you want to. So if you're able and it feels right, head over to the link in the show notes and become a Patreon. Even a small amount helps me more than you might think. And if not, keep listening.